This is my colleague, Lilith Estrada. She also deserves a hand for helping me put this together, too. She's my moral support. Lilith is my compadre at the University of Washington. Whereas I do institutional reporting, she does a lot of our annual giving, student calling, segmentation, data modeling kind of stuff for our reporting group. But she also works outside of the university doing some consulting work for small nonprofits and helping them organize their data and getting things put together with the OSTAR group. So.
Hi. So, as you said, I kind of have two different jobs. It's all above board. I work only 4 days for the UW. And so when we were designing this conference, I think probably the only thing I had to do with it was trying to make it so there would be information for smaller nonprofits, because having gone out and worked with them, I've realized that it's one thing to have a team of 20 people in your information management group who you can ask questions to, and maybe you don't come up with the best solution, but you can at least talk to someone who knows what it is you're doing. But if you're the only person in your development office who does anything related to database work, it's really lonely and it's really hard to find the information you need. So I am a little curious in the audience, just kind of, how many of you are the sole person in your shop that does this stuff? And then how many, maybe you have one or two colleagues? Okay, and then is everyone else a bigger, more supported shop? Great, so I was trying to make the talk so it would be appropriate to kind of every level. Obviously, if you're in a smaller shop, you're not going to do quite the level of segmentation we do in the bigger shops, but I'm going to kind of go through the whole thing. So I wanted to, just start with why you segment. I think most people just kind of know this, but to think about it in the very basic way is not everyone in your database is the same. You're going to have your major donors, you're going to have people who are very involved in events and things like that. And it's not just how they are to you, but it's how they want to be to you. I think that there's been this shift in fundraising that instead of just looking at people as we want to categorize them, is to really look at our friends and donors and try and figure out what's the relationship they want to have with us and how can we facilitate that relationship. And segmentation is one way to do that. We do it not just for annual giving, but we also do it for our magazine. There's two major magazines that are put out by the University of Washington that have very large populations. One is put out by the School of Medicine, and one is put out by our Alumni Association. And we actually segment those populations for cost and also method of delivery, things like that. So and then there's the stewardship component of we segment to make sure that we're going to communicate with you as a donor the way that you want to hear from us. Working with a food bank, and also I've been a donor to a food bank, and you think about, for me, if I'm giving to the food bank, I just want them to spend the money on food. I don't want them to have a dinner that they invite me to as a donor, because you should be buying food for people who need it, not for me. But some people really want to have kind of an insider relationship with your institution, and so you might segment your stewardship based more on, there's people who just want to be investors, they want to give you money, and they want to hear that you're doing what they wanted you to with that money. And there's some people who really want to feel like they know the ins and outs of your organization and kind of have the skinny on what's going on. So those are the main reasons why we might want to segment. Does anyone have other things that they do that I didn't kind of mention there? Because I'm sure there's additional reasons that we would segment. No? Okay. Wow. I think I've covered them all. So, the first step in segmenting is really having a clear idea of who is in your database. I've worked with organizations where there's 500 people in the database, and the way that they segment is they pull everyone out, and then they're like, okay, that person, no, let's delete them out of the list, and that person, oh, I know them, and they're actually on vacation, and so we'll delete them out. And what you're doing there is segmenting. But it's not the most efficient way. And I also hate to do work over and over and over again. I like to write a program and just make it do all the work and then tell everyone it takes the same amount of time. But, so I don't want to do the manual work because, you have the risk of error that you'll forget someone, or, you win the lottery. You want to be able to leave. You don't want to sit around and be like, okay, now, Carl, he doesn't like to get this newsletter. You just want to jet out of there. So if you have it all in your database coded, and you have the queries written, then someone can go in and say, oh, hey, here's the newsletter query. These must be the people. And you can look back and see, well, who's getting that newsletter and what are the criteria we're using. So, obviously if you've got more people in your database, you already know that you have to code these things somehow and have some sort of structure and documentation. So there's also a lot of different codes and fields that I've seen people use to segment. A lot of them are your mail communication or your communication control codes that maybe there's people who prefer nothing by mail. There's people who prefer only to get mail. They don't want to be called unless it's from this person. So in my segmentation, I actually have a lot of the different communication controls built in to these queries and stored procedures. There's also time of year. Some people have second homes, not probably many of us in this room, and they go somewhere else for certain times of the year. And so, at the University of Washington, we actually have events in those places where we have a large population that goes someplace for the winter. So you'd want to segment by, home type and, the season and things like that. You'd also want to segment by types of communication that they want to get. Some people never want to see, the report on the endowment they created. Some people only want to get newsletters from one area. They only want communications about one type of thing that your organization does. If you have like an international versus a national presence, maybe they only want to hear about your international work. So you kind of segment on that. And then also, I think the type of segmentation nearly everyone does is by donor amount. You're not going to send, most of us, an annual newsletter to someone who's given you, $5 million last week. So, or an annual solicitation. So you're going to try and segment by, is this going to be someone that we're going to ask for a lot of money versus can we just go ahead and ask them for that $25 now? I already mentioned the kind of stewardship things that you might segment by, and then also you might segment by where they donate to. And for universities, that's one of the main things we use, be it right or be it wrong. But before you can do any of this segmentation, first you have to kind of define, these are the people in our database, these are the types of things we're interested in, and this is how we're going to identify those people. And so you go through from your market definition. You're working with your development officer or your annual fund manager, and you're figuring out with them, okay, when you say you want all donors, what do you mean? Do you want any donor ever who's ever thought about giving us money, or do you want anyone who's given to a specific type of fund within a certain time frame? And so you really work with your end user, the person, if you have that person. If you're not that person, but even if you are, then you would document exactly what that definition means. And then you have to figure out, do we already have that, a place to store that? Do we have that coded? How can we go about gathering that information and making sure it's in the database in usable form? In my work at the UW, we have an entire team devoted to figuring out where the codes go and what they're going to be and who's going to enter them. With small nonprofits that I worked with, it is really, okay, well, let's get out your manual on your database that isn't supported anymore, and we'll figure out where we can put this code, and let's make them up based on how we're going to want to mail to these people. So, even when it's just you, that you need to go through and do that step and really document how you've done it and the decisions that you've made. And, then if you change your mind later, you want to make sure that you really think through the impact of that, because the problem with creating a structure is then, you go poke at it and the whole thing can tumble. So without documentation and definitions, you can cause yourself more trouble than you want. And, the most important part when you're doing all these segmentation specifications is you want to make sure and kind of check back in, you have your your internal client of your annual fund manager or whatever. And you want to really think through, is this really how our donors want us to communicate? I mean, they may have a brilliant plan, but it just doesn't pass the logic test, or it just may be unsustainable. Or it may be overly complicated. Not that anyone would ever come up with that. But, for a long time, we did in the School of Medicine, which is about half of the University of Washington when it comes to fundraising, they ran their own annual fund program. I wrote the programs for both of them. And they solicited by department. They solicited their residents by department. And I don't know, there's maybe 25 different departments, and they can be coded a variety of ways because they don't come through our normal process. Or they may just not be coded, is the other option. And, and so we had this huge structure in place, and I really don't know the politics, thankfully, of how that got switched over to central, and we quit soliciting by department for them, and it really didn't make any difference. So, you kind of have to think through, is this important to the donor? You may want to segment down so there's only 10 people in each segment, but, is this making logical sense with how we talk to people normally? Or can you just go and look those 10 people up and handwrite them, and I don't even have to do this query for you? It's the other option. So I'm going to walk through just a few examples of how I've seen things done. Obviously, I won't have too many different examples on smaller organizations because they just don't have the data to support. And once again, it doesn't meet any logical test because you do end up with 10 people in every segment. But for the smaller organizations, that I've worked with a museum that puts on, it goes to different air show events. And so one of the ways that they would segment is they would want to make sure when they're doing their mailings of notifications about different events that they'd want to make sure they're segmented by who attended that event last year. If they're going to an air show in North Carolina, maybe they might want to tell a few people who are interested in everything, maybe they're insiders, but they're not going to tell someone who went to the Everett Air Show who isn't going to travel to North Carolina. So they segmented kind of by their interest of specific types of airplanes because these were all airplanes that actually they're historic aircraft that actually fly. And so if they were going to take one of them out to fly, they would segment by the people who were interested in that particular aircraft. They'd also segment by the people who had attended events in specific regions. And then they also had, their people who they're volunteered and would actually work on the planes and things like that. And so they had kind of a segment for their dedicated, participants, their insiders. So that's just kind of one way that a smaller organization really tried to focus their communications to their population, even though it was really, less than, I'd say, about 1,000 people in their database. But that type of segmentation made sense because they were really letting people know about the events and about the information that was specific to their individual interests. There's also, I've done some work at a food bank, which is also a very small organization. And that is more focused on the donor and that is, I think, what we think of most when we think just generic segmentation is just by donor amount and recency, that's how they segment. Less than 500 people, you're really not going to segment much more than that. There's just not much purpose in that. And then I can tell you the overwhelming example of how we do it at the University of Washington for our annual giving. This will be a long, lengthy one, but I'm hoping that an example that is very complex will give you enough thoughts about how it might work on a smaller scale and just kind of go through the process. So one thing that we have, and I'm kind of interested in how many people have this versus just report out of their database, is we actually have a reporting database that hangs off of our database. We use Advance. So does anyone else have a standalone reporting system that's separate? Okay, so a few people do. It can be helpful if you have information you want to segment on that you can't keep in your database. Or if you're stuck with the system where the query to extract the data was written 10 years ago and it doesn't meet the needs you have now. One thing you can do, and I don't know if anyone went to Mike's thing, but I'm pretty sure he probably talked about how much he hates shadow databases, but one thing you can do, if you have a system that just doesn't meet your needs, and it isn't an option to change, is to, you pull out your data and you have maybe an access database that you pull it in. And what's nice is that pretty much everyone has access because it comes with Microsoft. And you can write different queries that will kind of do that segmentation. And you can store them, so if you pull your data out every time, then you can just run through those series of queries. And that would be almost creating a little standalone reporting system for you, where you've got some business logic that's previously built and stored that maybe you can't fit into the database you have now. So obviously, we have something much bigger because we have a whole team of people to do this. So we have a SQL Server 2008 database that nightly pulls data out of Advance, and it also stores additional data from other sources. I know, I feel embarrassed. It's like when you come and you talk to people and you're like, and then I've got a boat, and but this is just what happens when you work in a big institution, is you get a lot of people who know a lot of stuff and can do really great things for you. So in that nightly pull, we actually have some things that happen before they even hit our database, and they create extract tables that will wrap a lot of the data and put a lot of the business rules in place. That's managed by our central computing team. Changes, not that they're not great to work with and they aren't responsive, but I can't go in and reprogram their programs. So we also have some other extract tables that I maintain that deal specifically with segmentation. So we have what we call the solicitation extract, which we use for our annual giving appeals. And that is a store procedure that was probably written by Mike Messiah when he was 18. And it has been altered.
That was about 7 years ago, you're right.
So I've modified it a lot. Working with the annual giving team, as everyone knows, things change, ideas come into vogue, or different units decide they're going to form a whole new college and need to be merged with someone else. But I create that table, and it basically goes through and it looks at all of the different things that we have already defined as segmenting you. So there's people, we have our prospects, our big donors. We're going to hit them up for annual gifts if they haven't already given this year, and if they're not in 30 days to being asked of a major gift, or just been asked and haven't responded to a major gift. So I take, that's like 4 different codes. I take all that information, wrap it into one flag in my solicitation extract that says, are they in an exclude stage? And then if yes, then I don't have to go out and look at that. And when the prospect research team changes their definitions, I just have to go change it in one place, and I don't have to remember every time I want to pull something that code has changed. So I have that built in. I also have all the mail controls, because some people want to receive department newsletters but not annual giving solicitations. So I have that built in. Are they mailable? That's just a yes/no flag. I don't need to go out and look at the 8 different codes that pertain to whether they're mailable. I have the same thing for our phone, because we use that. We use the solicitation extract for the phone's segmentation also. I also go in and, because it couldn't be easy, we household group it for the mailing, because people get really annoyed when you send them 2 letters. And we call according to individuals. Of course, we have a lot of alumni who are married to other alumni. And so we have to figure out what segment you fall into as an individual and what segment you fall into as a household. So we go through and look at all of the degrees that you hold and all of the degree that your spouse hold, and then we determine if you and your wife both graduated from engineering, then you're in the engineering calling segment and the engineering mailing segment. But if you graduated from the School of Dance and your wife graduated from engineering, then you go into, for calling, you go into your own specific segment, but for mailing, we put you into a multi-affinity and you get a generic letter. And then also, if you donate, that the donating trumps. We figure if we don't know anything about you, we assume that you liked the school or department you graduated from. But if you did graduate from engineering but only give to dance, then we figure, maybe your life changed course, and now you're really into supporting dance. So we're not even going to talk to you about engineering because you're not given to it, so you don't care enough to really let engineering own you anymore. And so then we put you into the dance segment and we just completely ignore where you graduated from. And we do the same thing with if you give one place. And we go by the legal donor, which we know is not always accurate. We give credit to spouses, but it goes by who signs the check, which, I'm actually partnered with someone who graduated from UW, and I happen to pay the bills. So I end up as the legal donor, even though it's not me who's giving to the College of Education. Well, not that I don't love the College of Education, but I didn't graduate from there. So it is kind of a funny thing, but it's the best we have. It's really hard to call every household and say, so was that your choice or was that mutual? Or, we just kind of have to go with who the legal donor is. And then once again for calling, we also take into account if you and your wife both graduated from engineering and you're the legal donor to engineering, then we don't, because we pull the donor and non-donor segments at the same time, we don't want your spouse to end up in the non-donor segment and you end up in the donor segment. So I actually go out and have logic built in to determine whether you're the non-donor spouse of someone who donated to the area that you're in as a non-donor. So I don't even want to tell you how many lines of code this is because I don't even know. I know that my main program is well over 2,500 lines of code, and then that doesn't even take into account all that affiliation affinity logic, which is its own separate program. But that's the general on how we do the annual giving, mailing, and calling. We've also, in those segments, for calling, we've automated, I know, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing some people looking like, but that we have an automated system to pull down the calling segments. So we have figured out what the variable criteria are for calling segments. So we usually withhold reunion years because they get a special market. So I have a flag in there whether you're a reunion year. And then we also only call people under $999 annual donors. And then we have another segment for what we call the President's Club. And then if you give over $2,000 a year, we don't usually call you, not over 2,000, but over a certain level, there's a maximum cutoff, and then there's that President's Club range. And I'm trying to think of what other criteria are in, but what I've done is I've built a table that holds that criteria for every appeal the student calling is going to do. So the student calling manager can go in and just enter in those variables. When's the cutoff date? Because the other thing we don't want to do is we don't want to call your household, maybe your dance and engineering, but we don't want to call your household if we just called you last week. So we have a criteria in there when the last time we contacted someone in your household. And so that is a variable date that she enters into that table. There's a little web interface for her to do all that data entry. And so she just goes through and enters in all the variable criteria that we've defined, because it's essentially the same every time. And then she pushes the button and it runs the stored procedure that goes out, finds everyone who meets that criteria, and returns an ID list. And then we have another process that just pulls the exact same format every time because I'm all about making it easy. It pulls out that calling segment with all the data that we need. I mean, there's obviously, you're never going to get to the point where you have 100% standardization because there's always going to be a few one-offs, and you don't need to get there. If you do that, it becomes overly rigid, and you don't have the flexibility to be able to respond to a really great idea. So we do have, these standards, the standard segmentation, and then we have people come up with, these other, hey, I've got an idea. What happens if we were to call the marching band people? Can you do that? And so, but based on all those criteria that I know are going to boot them out, instead of just saying, oh, well, it looks like we have 600 people who are coded as being participants in the marching band, I can say, okay, it's 600 people is our base population, because this is what always happens is, oh, let's pull this segment. Okay, well, you got 600 people coded as marching band, but when you get down to have a valid phone number, haven't been called, haven't given, and all the other standard criteria, you've got 10 people left, and no, we're not doing that, So that is why having those kind of standards for segmentation are so important, because you can on the fly calculate whether this would be a viable market for the future. And then there's also, in addition to this kind of standardized, the annual giving, which runs pretty much all of our solicitations for, our annual fund. We have the School of Medicine, who, like I said, now their main letter goes out with the central annual giving letter, but they also have their own kind of giving club levels, and since they're big enough, we accommodate them. Some other schools would like to have this kind of service, but they just don't have, it's a return on investment. You're not going to raise that much more money if I do this for you. It's not going to be worth the time you're spending on me. So the School of Medicine has their own extract table, and it actually talks to that solicitation extract table, because I go through and calculate all of the School of Medicine standard things, that they have their own gift club level. They have their MD reunion year is, a very different thing. Reunion years are not as big in public institutions as they are in a lot of private institutions. So we really only do 50th reunion at UW. But MDs, it's a different deal. They really go with their cohort, and they actually do reunion year events at different levels. So I actually, in that medicine extract, calculate the MD reunion year and a whole bunch of the other medicine-specific kind of things. And then it goes back, and when it's done running, it talks back to the annual giving solicitation extract and says, okay, this person, he falls into one of medicine's segments, so exclude him from everyone else. So, and that's just the kind of the two big segmentations that we do for annual giving. We also do the magazine segmentation, and this is kind of a different way of doing it. That before we used to mail the magazines to everyone, but I think they're like $4 to make the magazine and mail it. And once you get to a point where you're mailing, a magazine 3-4 times a year to someone who's never responded to anything you've sent them for the last 20 years, then you start thinking, how much am I spending on someone where I'm not going to get, they don't seem to want to engage back with us. So, do we have the money? And really the thing is, we don't have money at this point to mail to everyone that we used to mail to. So I worked with the people who produced this magazine, and we tried to figure out how we can really pare down that cost. And, basically that ends up being by trying to target people who seem to be interested. There's people who actually, if for some reason they didn't get their magazine, they call and ask. Well, we put them on the list of people who actually always want to get the magazine. So now we know, no matter what, we're going to give them a mail version. There's also people who don't ever want to get the magazine. And then there's this huge pool of alumni who we had to kind of figure out, it sounds bad to say it, are they worth getting the magazine? Is it worth spending the money to send them the magazine? So we went through and looked at the different criteria. Since it's done by the Alumni Association, we code for whether they're Alumni Association members. We assume if you've gone through that and put up the money, then you want to hear from the Alumni Association. So we have that they kind of end up in the mailing pool. If you're a donor, we actually got the UW Alumni Association distribution people to talk to the people who deal with the annual fund and tried to come up with, can we use the same definition? Which is very nice. Instead of having to recalculate and then have them say, well, how come we have, this many donors, and you say over here we have this many, that we use the same definition for donors. And so we give priority to donors. We also segmented by campus, because then we don't have to pay for postage, so it cut down on the cost. So for our faculty and staff, we thought, oh, what a brilliant idea. We'll just send it to their campus box number, and that'll save us like $1. Except for that there's a few campus box numbers, it turns out they just send the boxes of the magazine back to us. And because they didn't want to sort through. We have a lot of medical faculty affiliated with children's, and then there's this whole other affiliated faculty who actually never go to their campus box. I did not know that until we started doing this. And so then we kind of had to say, okay, well then let's include that in that segmentation. So I actually go through and if you're a high priority and you're foreign, you actually will get a magazine. If you said you absolutely want this magazine, you can live pretty much anywhere in the world, we'll send you one. If you haven't said that and you're foreign and you're not a donor and you're not an alumni association, it's US, Canada only. And then I go through and I put in all the Canadian, because they have to be separated out. And then with the US mailing, I go through and figure out, are you a donor, are you an alumni association? Are you over 35? Or have you graduated in the last 10 years? If you're under 35 or graduated in the last 10 years and you're not a donor or an alumni association member, you'll get an email version. Or if you've told us you'd rather have the email version. That was a cost-cutting measure. So I actually end up, for one magazine, I end up with 5 different lists on the outside. So, and that really was to reduce costs. I do something kind of similar for the medicine magazine, but we also have the added complication of they like to send that one to organizations, which we don't normally send to. Yes?
What percentage of people opt for the email version?
Right now we have a fairly small percentage, but actually that was how we dealt with those campus box numbers that wouldn't deliver, is we had the administrators for those departments, and this was working with the med magazine, because that's the thing about a big institution. It's great because you get people doing all the different jobs, but then you also have everyone does their own job. So trying to get people to coordinate, it's like, okay, we have the same problem. But what we did was we had the administrators for those box numbers go out and actually talk to people in the department, and they all said, we want email. And so that probably tripled our email only. But in the smaller nonprofits that I've worked in, it's, if you've got an email, you're in the email, unless you've specifically said you don't want it. But I was really amazed because, especially with the flight museum that I worked with, which is not the Museum of Flight, but a different one, that, they're all World War II and before, really old aircraft. And so, and the guys that are in there are all, older guys. And, we have this, when we talk about sending by email, we have this perception that it's only going to be the young people who read their email, But all of their stuff went out via email. These guys were really tied into it, and they were really into the organization. And they'd give up their email because that's how they wanted to be notified for these different events. So I find, especially as a staff member or faculty, you've got your faculty or staff email. So, I argue that you're more likely to read that than if you get a magazine at home, as long as you're not the custodian. But, overall, people are pretty resistant, it seems. And actually, it was surprisingly hard to get them to agree to email it. We really had to, someone was like, oh, this would be a great way to save some money. I'm like, well, and don't forget, it's actually getting the magazine to people. Before, you were mailing it to them, but they weren't receiving it. So we're actually increasing the number of people who receive the magazine. And that was something that people had a really hard time getting, that you would actually, but we were mailing them before. It's like, yeah, but it only counts if they get it in their hands. So I could stand on the corner and tell you guys all a whole bunch of stuff, but you wouldn't hear it unless you're there. So, but we have been trying to work, I know that's Mike's thing, trying to get good emails, and we have, that's just a whole complexity. I don't want to get into too much about using email and whether that's been effective or not, but I know that's another thing with the budget cuts that a lot of the departments are really working on segmenting that way too. In fact, when we developed our ad hoc report request, I created so you could have more than one segment because so many people wanted the list of people we could mail to and the people we could email to and have them be mutually exclusive. I think that, there was one other thing that I was going to talk about with segmentation, which I don't know how many people saw Kevin's presentation. Okay. It was the data modeling, predictive modeling, okay. So that's something that we've been experimenting with, and he's really amazing. You see him back there hiding. But, I feel like if I say it, then everyone's going to dismiss that, well, we couldn't do this. But one of the things we're also doing, because we have so many never giver alumni, people who've never given us a gift, they've never communicated with us, that every year we're graduating more and more people, and finally we hit that point where it's like, okay, we can't keep hitting them up for gifts, we just can't mail to everyone and ask them for a gift anymore. So how are we going to decide who to segment out? So we have this huge pool of people we call non-donors, and they're people who haven't given to any academic fund in the past 3 years. So we actually went and built a predictive model and I took all of the non-donors in the past couple years who had converted to donor status. And we have this software, I'm not going to pretend to be a statistician, we have software that builds this model for us. And the main thing that you need for that is you need the data. And that's the thing that's great about this software is it builds the model automatically. So as long as you know your data and you can create a good extract, it can go out and create this model. And so what we did was we took all of those non-donors and said, okay, so of the non-donors who became donors, what do they look like? What variables were important to them? And we dumped in everything we could think of that might possibly be related. And we used that model then and we scored our non-donor population. And then we said, okay, we'll take the top 60,000 because that's how many we can afford to mail to. And so we actually did that level of sophistication with our modeling. We're trying that for our Alumni Association membership mailing this year too, which I'm really hoping I did it right because it took a lot to convince them to do it this way. And then I'm thinking, man, if I screwed that one up, they're never going to listen to me again. But I did a thing of who converted to becoming a UWA member and who had never been a member before. And, let's just mail to the ones. And what was interesting is he had a number, I think it may have been 60,000 for that, but he had a number of pieces he could mail. But when I scored it, really there were about 5,000 who ended up being likely members. And so what we're doing this time is we're taking the top of however many he was going to mail to, and then once we get the responses, we're going to see whether that worked or not. And maybe we would then use that instead of saying, okay, the top 60,000. Well, if we're getting the same response rate out of the top 10, forget about the other 50, and segment really based on something that is so complicated that my little human brain can't calculate, which is what the modeling software does. So I feel like that was a lot and very complicated and probably more complicated than anyone else even wants to. I think if I were starting this from scratch and annual giving came to me and asked me to do this segmentation, I would just say no. But I had the work of many other people before me to build upon and pilfer their code and use their logic. So,
How do we manage people who fall into a lot of segments so that we don't over-communicate?
well, that is one of the issues. And ideally, thank you for asking the question about the thing we don't do well. The idea with the segmentation on the annual giving side is that you only fall into one annual giving segment. And the same with so we're really only going to ask you for money on the annual giving cycle, that you don't end up in 8 different segments. And that was the whole reason behind that. Now what the departments do, the advantage is they don't have to pay for the annual giving solicitation, so that's a huge incentive for them to not send out another solicitation. There are some units that don't want to participate in that. Medicine was the one that took, I think, the longest to move them over, and we still give them their little section of people that they really like, and they, because they are half of the university, they get their own preferential treatment, that they get their top is just skimmed, they get to skim right off the top for their good donors. But we don't really handle as far as other types of mailings. You could be getting our UWA membership or magazine, you could be getting the medicine magazine, you could be getting, 4 department newsletters. I'm on the Department of Sociology newsletter, no idea how I get in that, because I'm not an alum, and I don't think I've ever given to them. But they must know me somehow.
I put you on the seated mail list.
I wouldn't know if I was on that. But, so there isn't really a good way, without getting into, we do have kind of what Carl's talking about with the preventing mea culpa. We do try to the best of our ability to track all the mailings that we send out. But as you might imagine, the huge institution that we are, there's just no way to know what people are doing. Yes, Mike?
You know, you mentioned that you have multi-affinity people who get a generic letter. And I think it might be better to describe that letter as something that hits on all of their different affiliations, which, our annual giving people work really hard to be able to construct a letter that merges in a lot of variables. And so if you have 3 or 4 affiliations, the letter you get, we hope touches on those things and then gives you the option to select one or more of those things. So I think that's another good way that we deal with it. So we got the schools and units to agree that they would share a piece of correspondence in the fall, rather than trying to beat each other, to the, let's see who can get the mail out fastest, and we're dumping on people in July,
I propose they all just get a big mud wrestling pit, and because I thought the entertainment value would be way better than watching me program, but no one went for that. So does anyone else have, you can certainly ask questions about how we do it, but does anyone else have other things that they're doing? What I'm interested in is in membership. That's something that I didn't really touch on at all. Do people do membership solicitations, and do you segment anyone?
We do a lot of direct mail, but we're not a membership organization, so we segment a lot based on the RFM, recency, frequency, monetary. But another way that we segment regularly is by giving channels, so we'll segment by online, direct mail responsive, and multi-channel.
Yeah, we don't use that, and I've wondered. We also do a whole email campaign, but those guys aren't up here to talk about that, so they don't get to say how they do it. But yeah, it is interesting that because we have a planned cycle for our annual giving, and we do a couple of letters, and then there's the calling segment, and the calling schedule is just kind of developed. There's so many schools that we try and get through all of them. But the best way, if you went to the UW, just send $5 in on July 1st, and you won't be hit up for anything, because the first thing we do is look to see whether you've given this year. So. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that for your major donors that fall into your segmentations, that they're pulled out only if they've given either already during the year or they're expected to have an ask in the next 30 days. How did you get that buy-in? Because for us, our major donors are completely hands-off from any direct mail solicitation, and what happens is, especially with our last campaign, we had thousands of people who were hands-off, and then major gift officers never got around to asking, so they weren't asked for 6
I think that was the key.
And now they're cold.
Yes.
And how do you get buy-in to, okay, if you're not going to ask in 30 days, they're going to get that mail.
Yeah, actually that just changed, because we used to include a different code that was an ask within the next year, but then we found a specific person who I won't mention, but we all know who she is, who had coded literally like hundreds and hundreds of people like that, and that's when. But I'm not sure. I bet Walt could actually speak to that.
We created a report to demonstrate that they were not being asked. We had we rolled up the campaign at the end and showed that we had identified several thousand prospects who never received a call or a letter because they had been excluded, like what you're saying.
Right.
So, and that was compelling evidence. They didn't give an annual gift, they didn't even get asked for a major gift, much less give a major gift.
And we paired that up with evidence that people who do get calls, who do get the letters, are more likely to eventually be major gift givers too. So those two things really mesh well.
That data that Mike's talking about was demonstrated that for individuals who gave $1 million contribution, and pick your number, it doesn't have to be $1 million, in any one year, that is, gave $1 million, they had 23 previous years of giving on average. So some had more and some had less. And that was what we coupled with the fact that if you don't write them, you don't start accumulating the 23 years, much less the millions.
I'll tell you one thing we do at James Madison, and we're doing it right now, is we actually
Originals would
whoever is
mark
left
anyway.
over, then we put it into an assigned calling pool, and they get a special message, obviously, as an assigned prospect, but we put the onus directly every year on them to not let him go without contact.
And that's essentially what we do at UW, except that we take it one step further where you don't get to say you're an excluder, you have to deliver them a proposal. And as soon as you deliver them a proposal, you get a window
That is
where they
good.
don't get called. So it's, yeah.
One of the things that we just recently did, sorry, you're getting the UW
Right.
work.
I paid them all.
Is we developed some new fundraiser performance reports. And on one of the reports, I love this report, it was fun to do and then fun to get the reaction, is I think we just did it with core prospects, and we list all their course prospects, and then there's a checkbox next to each name that says contacted this year and submitted this year, proposal submitted this year, and it's a checkbox. And when the data says that they filed or when they filed the contact or filed a proposal, then the checkbox fills in. So all of a sudden, we sent them out at the end of the first quarter for the first time, and they all got these lists that had all these empty checkboxes next to them, and they all went, and so it was just, you talk about visualization, is you had this list of all these people that are your core prospects that are supposed to be, your babies that you're coddling, and you have all these empty checkboxes next to there. Kind of, and then, so what we're hoping is that at the end of the next quarter, they'll get that report and say, look at all the new checkboxes that are filled in now, and that it's that kind of, personal competition within yourself to fill in your checkboxes. Because then, when you sit down at your review, your manager's also going to sit down with you and go, look at all these empty checkboxes, what are you doing?
Well, I think we definitely do have the advantage of having Walt, who, is a pretty good advocate and also, works really closely with all the other parts of the team to make that argument that you don't just get to globally exclude people. Because what you're doing is you're shooting yourself in the foot.
What has been the most significant segmentation as far as targeted fundraising effectiveness, like the most successful? What segment did you create that really kind of paid off?
So it's back here. We don't generally, because we do so much that is by department and school, it's one of those things that's very difficult to compare because, your dentists are probably going to give more than your philosophy majors. So I think that what's been most successful is not so much creating a new market, but the elimination of markets that weren't adding value. And, because we do have the programming power that they can come to me and I can do this, whereas, if it's just one or two people, then you say, yeah, that'd be cool, but I don't have, 2 weeks to do this. So for us, it's really, it's the streamlining of getting away from that, and Walt has something else to add to.
Just to follow up, that we created a concept called affiniation. And affiniation is, affinity is where people are actually giving, and affiliation is where they graduated from. Before affiniation, we always asked for the unit from which they graduated, regardless of where they give. Once we started asking for where they actually give, we had to bust up some furniture because it's all about, all these engineers are mine if I'm an engineering dean. But once we wrote that furniture, we said it's where they give, not where they graduated. It made a huge difference in renewal rates. It's a lot harder to ask someone for engineering who's given to dance and renew them for dance. You ask them for dance, make the case for dance, they not only renew, but they upgrade. So that was the big break on segmentation.
And I think that's the what Mike did before my time.
You talked about your mailing segmentation and not mass distribution. Have you received feedback on if that's gone well or if people stopped getting the magazine? Proportion of folks that called in and said, where is mine?
Yeah, we did get some people who called in and asked, I didn't receive my magazine. And then, of course, many of us are stunned. It's like,
That was
did
me.
you read that? Oh, okay. And
That
Steve.
was the under 35, graduated within 10 years,
Yeah, yeah, uh-huh.
don't
And
give
we
a
have
whole
your
heck of a
email.
lot of money,
Yeah.
kind of people, and then, that's my bathroom reading.
Right. And you know what? Then we sent it to them. Because what we're trying to do is make sure that we're actually communicating with the person the way they want to be
Right,
communicated.
do you have like any statistics on what percentage or what proportion that would be?
You know, no, but it was probably Joel. And one of it was about 20, 30 people.
I was gonna say, as being from school medicine, almost no one has ever called and said, I want something that they're not getting. It almost never happens. And when it does happen, it's just like Bill said, it's kind of a surprise. Like, oh,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that means we're doing the segmentation well, you know, so that we've stopped mailing people. Maybe that could be, or it could be that really people didn't care in the first place, as much as we thought they did. But either way, if they're not complaining, then it must be okay, it might be.
So they don't know that they're not getting it.
Yeah, but they used to get it, you know, so.
Yeah, some people actually know. I don't even know the distribution schedule, and I pull the list, and every time they ask, I'm like, oh, it's that time again, and that always amazes me. I didn't get my magazine last week. How did you know that?
It's a good sign of affiliation though, if people call you and say, right, something,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Is there a question in the back?
Yeah, question on, so you segment people that you cut it by mail, and you send them a response device. Now, the person goes online and makes the donation. Is there some mechanism to help you track that data element so that you know that this person received the piece and did the online donation?
Yes, we know that they've received, well, we know we've sent it to them. We can only assume they received it. Of course, with our incredible delivery rate that Mike does, then we're pretty confident that they've received it. I'm trying to make Mike nervous by being super nice to him today. But we do, so there's two ways you could do it. You could get your piece and go in and like say, hey, I received this and and actually put in information. Or you could be the loser like me who would just be like, oh yeah, what's that website again? And just going completely out, and then we'd have to tie it back together later. I don't know how much, when we do the analysis, or the kind of the reporting, we can't really for sure say, if you received, we sent you a mail piece, and then like a week later, you went into the UW website and navigated over to the foundation page and gave, and didn't say anything about the piece. We can't really be sure that you gave because of that mail that you received. But we do have the alternative of go to this place, right? My
Yeah,
position is more about that.
and one thing, because of these store procedure, and because this is so, we have a system down for this, the one area of our CRM where we really account well for having sent out a piece and contacting someone is in annual giving appeals. It's meticulous, it goes back 15, 20 years. We know every piece of mail that we generated for annual giving, and we know whether the person responded to it or not. And it's the same with the phone segments. So for those pieces, for those response devices, if they go to the website, we can pretty well make an inference, using the timing and the allocation, and determine cause and effect and decrement that appeal. On other stuff is actually where it's hard. If people pull down a list and don't put an appeal code on it, don't track that in advance, then when the gift comes in, we may not even know that there was a piece of mail that generated that if they paid online.
Well, and some people will also send a response device back from 2 years ago. Really?
We ask them though
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
web form, for if they're responding on response requests, or if they're paying on the pledge.
So that brings up a question. You're pulling your actual list from a reporting or extracted database, but then you're taking those IDs and actually loading them back in the appeals table.
And that's part of the segmentation process. So that way we can really know who ended up with what and be able to track it.
And that's great when someone calls you and is complaining about something they got in the mail. I remember this from because I used to work student calling, and we had the 1-800 number, so we'd get these calls. And I could look it up and see exactly what they were, probably what they were.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the weirdest problem I ever had to track down like that was someone received, I think it was a reunion year, And she's like, I didn't graduate that year. And so I went in, I look on her record, and it's like, you're right, you didn't graduate that year. And I couldn't figure out how she ended up in that segment. I went through all the different logic, and I was like, and tested it, and like, no, indeed, if I were to run that today, she wouldn't end up in that segment. And then finally, really went into her record, and for like a 2-week period, someone had changed her class year during the time I pulled that. And it was just one of those things of like, trying to figure out, but without having the logic saved and the program written and the rules really specified, I never would have figured that out. So, I wouldn't have been able to say with confidence, no, that was right when I pulled the data. Mm-hmm.
Curious, do you have more and more where the schools are wanting to communicate with their alumni more and more than, and I guess you're more school-based, your development officers are there, but we have more where the faculty and whatnot are wanting to send a personal message out to their alumni, and it's trickling down.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, it wasn't so,
Scattered.
scattered, and now it's like everybody wants to get their little
Right.
lab message out, and, of course, the person went through their college, so it's their alumni, so they have the first priority on sending whatever from their personal account.
Yeah.
It is-
Well, we don't really control communications. If you have 4 degrees from the UW, then you're available for that. All the different schools and all the different departments, if they want to send you their newsletters, if you don't want to receive them, then you call up and say, I don't want to receive this one or this one, just leave me alone. It's the solicitations that we really want to control, because it's okay for you to hear about 4 different schools and what they're doing, but we don't want to have 4 different schools asking you for money 4 times a year, because then you get people who say, I never want to hear from you again. And that's the relationship you're trying to avoid, is the I hate you relationship. So.
It's good though to have the fundraisers kind of be the arbiter of that and not the reporting. I mean, one of the things you don't want is to put reporting in the position where they're seen as the gatekeeper. Because then people start pulling lists and hiding them and stalking them. Our hope is that you hire fundraisers and that they have the expertise to do that, and they can kind of work through those issues with the faculty. And the reporting group doesn't have to assume so much of that responsibility, because in the long run, that's just kind of a recipe for disaster.
Last question.
We are kind of seeing more and more with our graduate schools that people are responding less to the generic kind of annual fund for their school and more to specific things to like what they actually graduated with. So the School of Education, or people want to give to organizational leadership or change and a scholarship for that instead of the actual general fund. Have you been segmenting it all based on that more specific kind of affiliation?
We do segment, for some of the schools, we segment by department. Usually there has to be a big enough pool, because just the writing of additional letter, I mean, is very time intensive. But we also do have units that don't actually graduate anyone. We have, the Office of Minority Affairs, the Student Life. There's some different programs that obviously no one's going to graduate from libraries. So we do try to segment those people, and that's something that's always under negotiation. I think if they were bigger, they'd probably have a little bit more power. Right now, it's like, okay, yeah, you get your 300 donors, but it's going to be a smaller pool that goes for that. And that's where we have our standard segments. And then, one area we have, the College of Arts and Sciences is this huge behemoth, and they have a pretty big non-donor population. If we want to play with stuff, we're like, hey, you can have some arts and sciences non-donors. And that is where we do try out different markets. But, that's what I was saying, is that you're not going to get it so it's 100%, and this is the segments we use, and we're never changing anything, because you do want to try new stuff, and you want to see whether something else works better. But if you have those standards set, you have the documentation in place, then you're not going to shoot yourself in the foot by accidentally, you know, oh, dang it, we were gonna mail them a letter next week and I just pulled them all and sent them this letter, you know, that, you know, not that I've done that. But, that you know, you can be a little bit more sure about, okay, here's my pool, these people weren't gonna really get anything very special, or I can pull them out and we can test the market with them, so.
You don't have to use the
Oh.
orchestra.
Well, thank you all very much. I hope that this kind of met what you were looking for. I wasn't sure what direction to go for it. But if you have any more questions, I'd be happy to give you my card or chat afterwards.
Your contact information is in the thing.